Hi, I'm Charlie. I'm a medieval historian. Let's answer some of those popular questions about the Middle Ages from the internet. Why were medieval shoes pointed? This is a great question. So the first pointed shoes start appearing in about the 11th century, and these are called pig ashes, and they're sort of long shoes with an upturned point at the end. Now, these sort of fade out of fashion in favour of something called the poulaines, which are just these incredibly long shoes with a point at the end. Now, these became popular in the 14th century. They came from Poland, and they made their way to England via the marriage of Richard II to Anne of Bohemia in about 1382. And they became a huge fashion statement in England. Medieval shoes became primarily popular with the upper classes. After all, you can't really till a field in pointed shoes, so it became a sort of sign of wealth and status among the upper classes. So much so that they actually had to start ban or restricting people wearing these shoes. For example, in 1363, Edward III introduces a law which restricts the length based on your social class for the size of your shoes. Why were medieval paintings so bad? I wouldn't say they were necessarily bad, it was just the art choice of the time. Like with today, we have much more simplistic artworks. Back then they had their own style, and that was just what was in at the time. So a lot of the paintings weren't necessarily photorealistic, like what we'd expect from maybe a landscape in the 18th or 19th centuries. But the medieval artwork sort of was hierarchical. It might display people of more importance in a larger scale in the frame, rather than, say, someone of a lower social standing who doesn't need to occupy as much of the frame. So it was basically purely based on hierarchy in that regard. And personally, I actually really quite like the style of artwork. I think it's a really good glimpse into the mind and the culture of these medieval people. Next question. Why were medieval people so ugly? Medieval people weren't necessarily ugly, it's just that we probably had different perceptions of beauty than they did back then. For example, a high forehead was seen as really attractive back in the day, and some people actually went as far as to pluck their hairline to ensure that they had that high look. But many people's appearance might have been affected by the things that they did during their life and the things that happened to them. For example, hard labour or malnutrition or even disease. So people could have the pox and that would be showing in their faces. Whereas obviously today we have modern medicine, which means that most people don't really have scars from diseases like that. Obviously some will remain, but for the majority of people we don't have that, so our perception of beauty is based on those standards. Whilst a little bit after the Middle Ages, Elizabeth I is actually known to have plucked her hairline, and you can see that in the paintings of her. Why did medieval peasants support the church? Okay, so the church would have been basically the centre of their lives. Everything they did would have revolved around the church, from the birth to their death. The church would have been the beating heart of the community. It provided people with not just spiritual advice, but also things like education, charity, and even putting on things like festivals for them. So people would have basically lived their lives around the church, and that was important to them. So much so that people willingly paid a tithe, which was basically a tax on their income. So they would have paid about 10% of all their earnings into the church, because at the end of the day, they wanted to make it to heaven, and in order to secure your salvation, you sort of had to pay into the church, and people would have been thoroughly believing in this, and that's why they supported the church. Why are medieval castle stairs always built clockwise? Now, the reason for this is basically to do with defence of a castle. So if a besieging army breaks in past the walls, it's going to turn to hand-to-hand combat within the castle grounds. And the best way of repelling an enemy is going to be fighting them within the confines of the castle. And obviously this means the defenders are going to be in the higher ground and they're going to be fighting down the stairway. And obviously most people are right-handed, so you're going to be attacking down with your dominant hand, your right hand. So if the stairway is clockwise, you're going to be able to swing your sword down. Whereas obviously if you're defending, you have to use your weak hand, your non-dominant hand, to fight upwards, which makes it really, really difficult to attack a castle. For example, in Stirling Castle in Scotland, they made the staircases extra narrow to make it even harder to attack the castle. And in doing this, you'd have to fight single file, basically uphill, and that's going to be a really, really difficult task. Why did medieval kings have court jesters? This is a great question. I think jesters are normally just seen as the clown in the royal court. So jesters were important in terms of entertainment, but they could also be there to relieve the pressure on other people in providing politically difficult information to a ruler. Jesters could provide humour into those politically tense situations, which someone else might not be able to do. And quite often they got away with it just because of their position as a jester, and so it was a really useful tool to have. But jesters weren't always necessarily just there for providing comedy or telling the king bad news. They could also be really skilled artists in their own right. For example, they could be really good at poetry or music, or even acrobatics. Did medieval peasants actually work all the time? No, absolutely not. I think this is a huge misconception that people think the peasants had a terrible, terrible way of life, but in reality, I don't think they would have necessarily stood for that for too long. And so the church found it really, really important to give them lots and lots of holidays. And they probably actually had maybe more holidays than you do today. So the church had many, many religious holidays, and they weren't allowed to work on those days. So they probably would have had over 100 holidays in the year, which is quite a lot when you consider how many days off you normally get in the modern world. Much of the work was also seasonal, which meant that sometimes you'd be really busy, and other times you might have periods where there's not so much to do. Around the Christmas period in particular, things settled down pretty much entirely until a thing called Plough Monday, which is sort of the reintroduction of agriculture into the start of the new year, essentially. Did medieval people really get married at 12? No. So it depends on the circumstances, but for the most case, no. The common person probably would have got married in their 20s, almost like we would do today. The reason why the idea of people getting married about 12 comes into play is because of the idea of kings trying to basically bargain alliances and secure their borders. And by doing this, whenever they'd have a kid, they'd be able to start negotiating with other leaders and rulers and go, oh, well, I've just got a child. We could marry them off to your daughter, or we could marry them off to your son and secure an alliance in that way. So quite often they would secure these alliances way earlier than might normally be accepted at the time. But that doesn't mean that the wedding was necessarily consummated and sort of made official up until that point. Although that's not to say that it did happen. So in the case of Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry VII, she was actually married twice by the age of 12, and she actually had Henry VII, or the future king, Henry Tudor, when she was about 13 years old, which was seen as ridiculously early even for the time. And after she dies, there's even a comment by someone who says that was ridiculously early for her to give birth for such a small person, basically. Did medieval people ever go on vacation? The answer to this is sort of yes. But not as in what we'd probably determine as a vacation today. So they would primarily go on religious holidays. They would go on pilgrimage, essentially. They would find a shrine that they'd want to go to, and they would go off and go on pilgrimage. But that's not to say that pilgrimage was necessarily this entirely religious undertaking. For the most part, it was sort of what happens on pilgrimage stays on pilgrimage. There would have been a lot of things like drinking, gambling, copulating. It would have been a very fun thing to go on, almost sort of a lad's trip today as such, or sort of a girl's trip. You're going there with your best mates, and you're going to have a good time, because at the end of it, you can get absolution from one of the holiest places in all of Christendom. So people took this as an opportunity to just have a great time, essentially. The upper classes would have travelled a lot more and sort of done more what we would consider to be a traditional vacation. They would go hunting, they would go and stay at other courts around Europe, or they might attend festivals or go to someone's marriage. So they would travel a lot more, but that's not to say that they all did all the time. What did medieval people use instead of toilet paper? This is a great question. I think the practicalities of everyday life we sometimes take for granted. We know a few things that they would have used. So if we look back to Tang, China, this is between about 600 and 900 AD, so just over 1,000 years ago, an Arab traveller went there and he noted that they were using paper. This is before paper even gets to Europe at this point. So they were using paper to wipe themselves, which in comparison to the Arab traveller, he probably would have just used water to clean themselves after going to the toilet. In Europe, they might have used things like moss or leaves, hay, anything that they could really get their hands on. They might have just used water in a river and sort of just splashed themselves. Wealthier people might have used things like wool or cloth or lace, pretty much anything like that they could get their hands on when they went to the garderobe. What was the bulge in medieval clothing for? Okay, so the bulge that you see in medieval clothing is called a codpiece. At first it sort of served a practical purpose, basically for you to put the crown jewels, so to speak, because there would have been a gap in the hose or your trousers, and you would have needed a place to store those precious things. And it would have acted almost like a flap to relieve yourself. You could open it up and relieve yourself when you needed. But over time, it slowly becomes a bit more of a status symbol. People would pad it out and make it look bigger. It was also a bit of a sign of masculinity to say, oh, well, I've got this huge codpiece. I think famously, again, a bit later than the Middle Ages, but you see Henry VIII's armour, and he's got this huge codpiece built into his armour. Totally unnecessarily, maybe he's just compensating for something at that point. What did medieval people think caused disease? So medieval people sort of got their idea of disease and plague and everything from the ancient Greeks, and this idea sort of persists right through. So they take Hippocrates from the 4th century BC. Medieval people knew of this thing called a miasma, which is basically bad air. That's why when the Black Death comes around, people start holding flowers to their face to basically breathe in the clean air that they're producing. Although we know now that obviously that wasn't the cause of disease, but they believed it, and hence we get the nursery rhyme of ring around the roses. What were conditions like in medieval mines? I think medieval mines are totally overlooked, but they're really, really interesting because no one talks about them. So in short, the conditions would have been absolutely terrible. They would have been horrid. So when you go down, they're going to be extremely dark. They're going to be really liable to flooding and cave-ins, and also fumes, like toxic gases that would be circulating around. So a lot of the miners that would go into these mines would end up with respiratory problems because of all the dust that would be kicked up. And that would be really bad. A lot of miners didn't even live past the age of 30 because of this. Miners would have worked with pickaxes and hammers, and they would have worked for extremely long hours, often in almost total darkness, which is not too dissimilar from mining even into the 20th century. The work would have been absolutely backbreaking, and some of these miners would have been literal miners, as in children. They'd be smaller because they'd be really cramped conditions, so if you could get a child in, then they're probably going to find it a bit easier, which is horrid. An example of one of these mining towns is a place called Kutna Hora in what is now modern-day Czechia, in what was Bohemia. It was founded in 1260, and in 1300, King Wenceslas II gave it a royal decree, basically issuing the orders and the regulations for the mines. And this was a silver mining town, so a lot of wealth sprung up from there, and it basically became the second city to Prague during this time. Miners worked in mines over 500 feet in some cases, and they only had a tallow lamp for light. How did medieval armies move huge siege weapons? This is a great question because these weapons were huge, and to just move them overland would have taken months and months and months. Imagine you're in London, you've built this siege weapon, and you want to transport it to go and siege Edinburgh Castle. That's going to be a long journey. So in order to do that, you'd break down the equipment into smaller parts, and then you'd load them onto pack animals and carts, and you'd transport them that way. Alternatively, if that's going to be too much effort, if you're going abroad, you might actually just find the resources nearby to where you're besieging and build the siege engine from scratch, essentially. For example, Edward I's Warwolf trebuchet, which is probably considered to be the largest trebuchet ever built. It was built in 1304 to besiege Stirling Castle, and it took so long to build, it's reputed that it was never actually fired in combat. Apparently the Scots had surrendered by this point. I think Edward I was a bit annoyed that they hadn't got to fire it, so he essentially ordered everyone to stay in the castle, no one to enter it until he had at least fired the first shot. How did medieval people keep their money safe without banks? So they'd probably do pretty much what you'd do today if you weren't going to take your money to the bank. You'd probably just hide it. So that's what most medieval people would have done. And if you're going to hide it, you're probably going to bury it somewhere familiar that you can come back and retrieve it from. And this is where we got a lot of hoards from. So a hoard is basically just like a buried treasure, essentially. And some of the most famous examples of this include things like the Curedale hoard, which is over 8,500 objects of silver, sort of coins, hack silver, ingots, jewellery. And this was found near the River Ribble, probably a Viking hoard, probably from the expulsion of the Vikings in 902 in Dublin, and they would have crossed the sea and buried it. There's various theories about how it was actually buried in the first place, but chances are it was someone extremely wealthy, this extreme amount of silver, and they buried it in a place, it was in a bend in the river, and they probably buried it thinking, I'll come back to that at some point. But either they died before they could retrieve it, or they forgot where they'd buried it in the first place, which is probably not too uncommon. How did knights go to the toilet in armour? with a great deal of difficulty, to be honest. Knights would have had squires that would have helped them put their armour on, because it was incredibly difficult to do, and it was more than just a one-man job. In the same case, they would have had them help them take it off as well. Some armour had built-in flaps to help you relieve yourself when you needed to, but for the most part, especially in the heat of battle, you're not really going to have the time to leave the lines and undress yourself to a point where you could relieve yourself. So in the heat of battle, you'd probably just go within your armour, although your squires would probably hate you for it afterwards, having to clean it all out. If we looked at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, pretty much the entire English army had dysentery at this point, and probably most famously, all the archers, well, not all the archers, but most of the archers, at least some of them would have had dysentery, which meant that they are reputed to have had their trousers down when they were firing their arrows. Obviously, we don't hear about the knights in this case, but the knights also probably would have had dysentery, and in that case, you're just going to be going in the suit of armour, and then someone's going to have to clean that afterwards. Probably your squire, unless you're incredibly embarrassed, in which case you might do it yourself. Anyway, that's been the internet's most popular questions about the Middle Ages. I hope you have enjoyed, I hope you've learned something, and please don't forget to subscribe and come back for more. And if you did enjoy, why not check out this video next?